In the application, let's write a custom directive that will take the value in the username input and send it back to the web server to see if the web server thinks the username is valid. I already have an endpoint set up on the web server. It is at /API/name validation. All you need to do is pass the name as a query string parameter, and after a 2-second delay, the API will tell me if that value is valid or not. It will just return a true or a false in JSON. And currently, to keep things simple, if you pass a username that is less than 3 characters, the service will return false, but if you pass something that is more than 3 characters, it will return a true. And the way I'd like to perform this validation is by writing a custom directive, let's call it username. Any input that is attached to, it will be taking the value and sending it off to the web server. So I already have the shell of a username directive ready to go. All we need to do is set up the directive definition object, and just like our start with attribute, I'm going to restrict this to being only an attribute, and I'm still going to require the ng model controller, and that means I will have a linking function that takes scope, element, attributes, and ng model. However, unlike the last directive that we wrote, instead of attaching something to $sign validators, which are always synchronous, I'm going to attach something to $async validators. But once again, it will be a property that matches my directive name, and it's going to point to a function. In this case, instead of writing it as an anonymous function, let's come out and write a named function, validate username. Just like with a synchronous method, Angular will call this at the appropriate times, and it will pass in the value that needs to be validated. But what's going to be a little bit different about this function is that instead of returning true or false, is this valid or invalid, I need to return a promise, because we're not going to know the validation result until sometime in the future. And in this case, I need to call the server to perform the validation, so I'm going to inject HTTP and return a promise that is based on http.get plus a little bit of processing. So I know I need to go to /API/name validation, and I need to pass the name as a query string parameter, so it might be good to use encode URI on our value. And then I'll do a little bit of processing on the response. Because instead of returning true or false, is this valid or invalid, I need to return a promise. And if I resolve the promise, I'm telling Angular that the value is valid. If I reject the promise, I'm telling Angular that the value is invalid. So that might be a little bit different than what you typically do with an HTTP call, because even if the HTTP call is successful, if it returns a false, I need to turn that false value into a rejected promise to make sure that this model value is marked as invalid. So basically, if I look at the response.data property, if it is true, I want to make sure I resolve this promise. So let me bring in the queue service and explicitly return a queue.when with true. So that's a way of saying, give me a promise that will automatically resolve and deliver the value true. Otherwise, I want to use queue to return a promise that will be rejected and deliver the value false. Let me save that file and then just come into our messages template and add one more error message here. So this will be an ng message for username, and we can have a generic message here like invalid username. Let's save all this and try it out. I'll refresh the page, type in an S. You can see there's a pending HTTP call, and I get back invalid username. But if I type SCOTT, that works, and that is successful. Now, other than our generic indicator for an outstanding request, is there another way to give the user some feedback that we are, in fact, doing something with this username? And the answer is yes. If I come over into our page, then let me just write a little bit of HTML here. What I want to do is have checking username up here, but only if we are actually actively performing a validation on a username. Unfortunately, that is easy to do with Angular. All I need to do is look at profile form.username, and there will be a $pending property on that object if there is currently an outstanding asynchronous validation being done on this field. So if I save this and come back, let's refresh one more time. I'm going to type in SC. You can see there's checking username that appears, and then it goes away. It's invalid. Let's fill it out the rest of the way. We're going to check it, and now it's complete. So just like I dynamically added ng messages into my view, I could also dynamically add this ngIf that checks the pending flag. And I could do that wherever the username attribute appears. Let's do that. Down here in the directive definition, let's have a setup DOM function. And what I'm going to need is I'm going to need a reference to the input element, a reference to the form because we're going to need the form name so I can build an expression like profileform.username.pending. And I'm going to need the scope object because we're going to do some dynamic compilation just like we did earlier in this module when we dynamically added ng messages. So let's inject the compile service. And inside of here, I could say that the input name is this input element. Let's get the attribute name. The form name is very simple. If you give me a form controller, I can simply do form.$name. We've also done that previously in this module. And then I need my HTML that I'm going to append into the page. So you don't have to watch me type that out because that can be painful sometimes. I'm going to paste something in, but it's basically the same HTML that we just looked at in home.html. I'm just building it dynamically now. So it's a div with an ngIf that looks at the form name, .input name, $pending. And now I just need to compile this and append it to the input's parent. So let's go to the input, get its parent element, and do an append on $compile against this pending markup, and you have to compile against a scope. Or rather, execute the function that $compile returns against a specific scope. So now I need to call setup DOM, and I'm going to have to change a few things around. In addition to the ng model controller, I'm also going to need the parent form controller, and that means my linking function no longer gets just ng model. It's going to get an array of controllers. The ng model will be controllers sub 0. The ng form controller will be controllers sub 1. And I can now call setup DOM and pass in my element, which is the input, pass in the ng form controller, and pass in the current scope. Let's give it a try. I'll save all files. Let's refresh. Type in an SC. I can see there's checking name. It's invalid. I'll fill out the rest of the username, and now we're valid. And once again, we're taking advantage of directives as heavily as possible to take care of all the boilerplate code that usually appears in a form. I have all sorts of validation messages and text that appears when there's an asynchronous validation, and all of this happens without me explicitly typing in all of that HTML for every form input. I just have form input directives, username directives. They're going to dynamically add things into the DOM when needed. And although this form might not look like the exact form that you want, hopefully this module has given you some ideas about how you can write directives to build the forms that you need for your application.